mourners gather in the countryside in Gansu Province. A man is being buried in the tombs near Fangmatan, and his family have sent goods to be put in with him. There's food, money, fine clothes, and a set of beautiful maps, engraved on pine wood with black ink. All these things are put carefully inside, and the tomb is closed and sealed and slowly forgotten, at least for the next 2,000 years. It's well known how advanced Chinese culture and society has been over the course of human civilization. Whether it's the development of gunpowder, the use of paper, or the invention of the compass, China has often been the sharp point of human advancement, technology, and philosophy. The use of maps and the history of cartography in China is no different. Some of the most ancient maps we have from China are incredibly modern in their design, purpose, and technique. In this video, we'll look at 3 of these most ancient of maps, from the Warring States period, the Qin Dynasty, and the Han Dynasty. Now, regardless of how advanced we might consider a society to be from our standpoint today, it's important to try to see the artifacts and clues we get from history on their own terms as much as we can. We'll always be caught up in projecting our own ideas onto the past, but at least knowing this and trying to minimize it can help us appreciate people from long ago more generously, not just from our own ideas about what's advanced and what's primitive. In particular, we're going to take that spirit when we look at these maps. We don't just want to talk about how modern they might seem, but also how they can mix spirituality, art, economics, bureaucracy, and science together in different ways that might seem odd to us today. Through the maps, then, we can see the edges of an entire culture. So let's get into it. Although what counts as a map can be contentious when it comes to ancient history, one of the oldest Chinese maps is generally considered to be this bronze plate, dating from at least the 4th century BC. It maps out the inside of a tomb or mausoleum and was itself found inside a tomb in Hunan Province in 1978. The tomb belongs to a king. The map has south at the top and shows the plan for an area about 200 by 400 meters in size, complete with multiple sacrifice halls, a grave mound, and other small buildings. The map is extensively marked with annotations, which gave linear measurements for the building dimensions and distances between objects. This was actually a second copy. It says so right on the plate, as another was put into the state archives and this one into the tomb itself. Interestingly, the entire tomb depicted was never actually totally finished because it was started during the Warring States period in Chinese history, and kings rose and fell too quickly to build elaborate multi-generational tombs in peace. This map starts us off with a remarkable attention to symbology, annotation, careful measurement of distance, and real-world practicality in Chinese cartography. If we compare this kind of map to more cosmographic world maps found in ancient Babylon, something becomes really clear. This early Chinese map seems very down to earth and really quite recognizable to us today. We still make floor plans, architectural drawings that aren't very different from this one, done on bronze almost 2,500 years ago. Our next set of maps comes from about 100 years later and are of a completely different style. They're ink on pine boards, back and front, and show a very large area at scale, including rivers, woods, passes, and more. These pine boards were also found inside a tomb, this time at Fangmatan in Gansu Province, and it took 2 years of careful slow drying to restore them to the condition you see here, as most of the tomb was waterlogged when it was excavated. In this same set of tombs, by the way, Chinese archaeologists also found the oldest piece of paper that we have in the world. And can you guess what it is? That's right, it's a map. Of course it's a map. It's just a scrap, so we can hardly make it out, but it just proves that maps are everywhere and people love them, no matter when in history. Anyway, back to the pine board maps, which are preserved much better than the paper, so we can actually analyze them a bit. They're really incredible. The extent of the detail and the information portrayed in these maps is astounding. Just some of the things outlined here include specific gullies, mountain passes, transportation checkpoints, directions of rivers, stands of specific different types of forest timber, including pine, fir, cedar, orange. There's wildlife, there's distances between locations, there's roads and mountains, and 82 different settlements, all laid out with characters on the map. It's amazing. The only thing missing that makes it not a totally modern map, some scholars say, is that it doesn't use latitude and longitude. Pretty much everything else is there, including scale and topography. There are 7 maps in total, although one is kind of unfinished, and we don't know for sure if they're just overlapping and make up one large mosaic, or whether some of them represent a more zoomed-in scale, whereas others are more zoomed out. It's possible to fit together the maps because of the overlaps, at least roughly as you can see in this diagram. The area we figured that they cover is something like 100 by 70 kilometers, which comes out to around a 1 to 300,000 scale. There are 3 different river systems mapped, which, by the way, have accurately divided river basins and drainage watersheds. Of the 82 settlements that are mapped, only 3 are still known today: Di, Guixian, and Xixian. The main features of these maps seem to be the rivers, the roads, and the forest stands of timber, suggesting that maybe these maps were used by merchants or for economic purposes by Qin bureaucracies at the time, namely forestry and harvesting wood. The man who was buried with these maps is figured to be a Qin official of some kind, although why the maps would be so important that he would be buried with them is a bit unclear. Another item found in this tomb was a set of texts describing the story of a man named Dan. Dan was a military officer who, after accidentally disfiguring a colleague, committed suicide. He was buried outside the city and then came back to life 3 years later. Since he had died an improper death, he needed to go through a proper burial in order to be turned into a good ancestor instead of a malevolent ghost. Dan, according to the manuscript, gave extensive details about what it was like to be dead and what kind of burial practices the dead prefer. He told people not to give the dead torn clothes, not to cry before the dead eat their meals, and definitely make sure you don't damage their shoes. His coming back to life was actually the result of this kind of long bureaucratic process in the afterlife, and so the idea of this afterlife administration is very much a part of this whole spiritual world. Dan's tale is very interesting, and you can check out more about it in links in the description. Now, the last maps we'll look at, like the others, also come from a tomb and are also remarkable for their accuracy and attention to detail. They're on silk and come from the Han Dynasty about another 100 years again after the Fangmatan maps. They were found in Mawangdui in Hunan Province in the 1970s. They are very detailed and carefully made. One of them was mostly in tatters, while the others were mostly intact, and the different maps do depict fairly different things. This one shows more topographic information, such as mountains and rivers, whereas this other one is more zoomed in and seems keyed to military purposes, showing army locations and much more color and detail that might be important to military commanders, like passes or river crossings. These Han maps are often lauded for their attention to scale and detail, symbology, and their usefulness to our modern eyes. And they really are quite incredible, and so recognizable to us as maps. We're still stumped as to how these people managed to survey such large areas in really difficult terrain with such accuracy and clarity. One thing is definitely clear to me: all these maps are pretty amazing. They're just so far beyond the other maps that we have from history at this time, ones we actually have physical examples of, no matter where you look in the world. So there's no doubt that, yet again, in this kind of physical mapping, China was at the sharp end of human civilization. In the development of Chinese cartography over the next 1,000 years, complex grid systems were created for mapping the land, and studying the changes of administrative boundaries became very important for cartographers. So we have some good reasons to focus on the scientific and down-to-earth side of these maps. But then it can be tempting to stop there and not really try to understand the way that the people who made and used these maps might have seen them. We can end up carrying a little modern checklist. Scale? Check. Topography? Check. Latitude and longitude? Not quite there yet. But this checklist approach seems to miss a lot of what these maps might have actually been. These maps were literally found in tombs. They aren't just secular objects, they're also religious ones. They might help guide spirits in the afterlife, help ensure that tombs are arranged correctly, or ward off demons and malevolent ghosts. They're definitely art as well, and status symbols. It's not necessarily the case that art and cartography were seen as different things in these early days. Today, we tend to separate them. There are artistic maps and there are accurate maps, and we don't really mix them up. But these maps have little images and drawings on them, as well as accurate depictions of rivers and passes. They're beautiful and colorful as well as useful. These maps could have been hung on walls or kept as objects of status to show off how a merchant or a ruler could create such beautiful pieces of knowledge. Being open like this lets us see these maps more on their own terms rather than through what we want to see. And when we do that, the precision element fades back a bit, and we do find some baffling details. The scale isn't always as precise as it seems, and sometimes even seems to vary within one single map. And it's not always clear exactly what distances are referring to, because they're often given just between points without the points being specifically mentioned. The maps overlap in the case of the Fangmatan maps, but not precisely, and sometimes the little drawings are so fanciful that it doesn't make sense in a totally rational idea of map making. So I'd like to think that these maps are rational, but they're also artistic, spiritual, and political. In any case, it's really quite a treasure for all humankind that these maps even exist and have been found, and it's a joy to look at them and see such recognizably modern norms. These maps are hardly foreign to us today, unlike many other historical maps. But it's also wonderful to be able to open our minds to different ways that cartography can be used, whether that's religious or secular, art or science, or best of all, having no distinction between these categories that we carry with us today. One of the greatest parts of studying ancient cultures is the encounter of ways of thinking that differ from ours, and I think these maps do exactly that.